Morning, everyone. Welcome to Managing Down Model Validation Costs. We're going to give another minute before we get started, just to make sure a few more people can log in. Prior to that, there's a few housekeeping things, just to ensure that the webinar goes smoothly. Just so you know, everyone is muted during the call to help us prevent background noise and to make sure we can all hear clearly. If you have any questions, you will see in the GoToWebinar panel question box. Feel free to ask anything in there, and at the end, we're going to have a brief Q&A session to address any questions that might have been submitted during that time. Last thing is, you'll be given a short survey after the conclusion of the webinar. So please fill this out to help us get some feedback on these events. And without further ado, I hand this over to Tim Willis and Nick Young.
All right, thanks, Patrick, and welcome everybody to today's webinar. My name is Timothy Willis. I lead RiskBased Model Risk Management Practice, and our topic today is managing down model validation costs. This is actually a follow-on presentation to a webinar that we presented back in February on this same topic. We had a lot of feedback on that, and so we wanted to review some of the content from that webinar just for context and then incorporate in some additional perspectives. So as always, we appreciate your investing this time with us, and we're going to do our best to make it worth your while. Joining me today on the webinar is Nick Young. Nick is a RiskBased director and the lead validator in our model validation practice. As you can see from Nick's bio, he has extensive model validation experience from really both the second line bank side and from the consulting side. He also has experience as a regulator, and so he's really dealt with model risk from pretty much every perspective, and really adds a great deal of value to these sorts of discussions and to kind of model validation in general. We've organized this webinar around the same basic categories as our February webinar, though we're going to approach them a little bit differently and in greater depth. I'm going to begin by reviewing the concept of what we call the model risk management value curve. That's where we discuss the not always straightforward relationship that exists between MRM spending and overall costs related to model risk management risk. And we'll talk a little bit about how not all dollars spent on MRM are created equal. Nick will then review some of the purposes of model validation, discussing the relative importance of each of those and how understanding the proper balance of these various purposes can help inform model validation budget decisions. He'll then discuss the risk-based approach to prioritizing model validations and some tips for making process monitoring more cost-effective. I'll then wrap things up with a discussion around balancing internal versus vendor resources and some tips for not spending more than you have to on external validations. So as Patrick mentioned, we'll have some time for questions at the end, so please feel free to enter those anytime into the question box in the GoToWebinar panel that you should see. As we discussed in February, I like this graph as a simple way of illustrating the notion that even though model risk management is unquestionably a cost center, I mean, anybody who's worked in model risk management and is under cost pressure understands that they are a cost center. Strategic spending on MRM can also function as something of an investment in that it can reduce other types of costs, including costs that don't always appear to be related to model risk management. The examples I like to use they include demonstrating that significant investment has gone into robustly and thoroughly validating an allowance model, for example. It may prompt a regulator to permit a bank to hold less regulatory capital. we're not accustomed to thinking of the cost of holding excess regulatory capital as an MRM-related cost, but it certainly is if you're holding more capital than you would have to if you were subjecting your allowance model to rigorous validation standards. Obviously, as depicted by the left side of this curve, you could have an MRM spend of 0, but that will almost always lead to significant MRM-related costs that are simply incurred by the bank as a whole. There are unquestionably costs associated with models that don't work well, models that require costly workarounds and other manual processes. It's generally more favorable and cheaper to respond to improvement suggestions from a model validator than to have an examiner tell you the same thing in the form of an MRA. The other cost savings is that well-validated models drive better business decisions. A model that might be used to allocate resources based on business forecasts that are based on projected macroeconomic conditions. When those models are badly wrong, those costs can be difficult to measure because they're spread so thoroughly throughout the bank. But even though these costs are hidden, they're still real. So MRM spending toward these ends can actually drive total MRM-related costs down, but there is this inflection point at the bottom beyond which the spending becomes counterproductive. So that's the right side of the curve. And this type of spending, the spending beyond what is necessary to maximize model performance, it really serves only to increase the overall MRM-related costs without any measurable benefit, and is obviously the type of spending that we're all seeking to avoid. You don't get extra credit for validating a high-risk model 4 times a year. The goal is just to achieve the desired benefits and really not to do anything more than that. So moving on to the next slide here. Yeah, so finding the target, that low point on the value curve requires MRM departments to employ a strict risk-based evaluation process to all model risk management related activities. Risk-based approaches help ensure that MRM departments are only engaging in activities that improve model functionality, that enhance business decisions, and that reduce or eliminate the likelihood of an examiner finding a problem and creating more work than you would have had to do if you'd simply done it right the first time. Risk-based approaches also help model risk managers avoid moving up the right side of the curve. So that would be avoiding too frequent validation of models that have higher risk ratings than they warrant, validating things that look like models but aren't really models, performing full scope validations when limited scope validations will do, and really chasing statistically significant samples when that just isn't necessary. So we're trying to do the things in the green box, trying to avoid the things in the red box, and when we do that, we hit the bullseye in the bottom of the curve. So Nick is now going to spend some time talking about some of the whys of model validation and how they relate to cost management. Nick.
Hello, everyone. My name is Nick Young, like Tim said. A lot of what we do is really based on the idea of what a validation is. You wouldn't believe how many people ask us that question. And really, a lot of people, I think, have the misperception that validation is solely a regulatory compliance exercise. What do I mean by that? Basically, we're only validating the model to meet OCC 2011-12 or SR 11-7. That this is solely an exercise purely for the benefit of your regulators, the examiners, and really it's just a cost associated with your regulatory compliance. I tend to disagree with that view. I think there are a lot of benefits, unique benefits, that validation can provide beyond a purely regulatory compliance angle. It's important to remember that validation is solely a risk management process, and that quantitative models, by their very nature, if they meet the definition set forth by the regulators, are inherently carry a large amount of risk due to uncertainty. Validation has the benefit of being able to not only identify these risks, but offer concrete remediation steps to mitigate some of these risks before they're really materialized. And in basically every case that this has happened, the cost of remediation significantly is less than the cost of the validation. The cost of the remediation after the validation is significantly greater than the cost of the validation that would have caught it in the first place. So we just give 6 examples right here based on actual real world experience, what financial institutions have incurred when they have used an inaccurate or a non-performing model. So starting from the top, and I'll move clockwise, increased credit losses. For models that you could consider like a credit origination or a credit account management scorecard, if the model isn't accurate, it could increase your credit exposure. In some cases, depending on the riskiness of your portfolio, you're talking about loss percentages which may increase from, say, 10% to 20%. But that 20% could represent, in some cases, millions to hundreds of millions in additional losses. An inaccurate model wouldn't catch that additional 5%. The second one is no disaster recovery. A lot of this is based on the idea that if everybody who uses the model suddenly leaves the bank, what are you going to do? A lot of this is captured in model documentation, which, as all of you know, is a responsibility of the first line. But usually that documentation is not clear or sufficient enough to really warrant somebody else in the organization who has absolutely zero experience being able to not only understand what the model is doing, but actually operate it accordingly. So what validation does in this case is we identify the weaknesses in a disaster recovery plan and highlight those such that any future disaster, you would have the documentation and the procedures to basically move forward with your model and still be able to use it. So the next piece would be increased legal cost. A lot of this is related to inaccurate models, such as things like BSA AML, which would be Bank Secrecy Act or anti-money laundering. BSA and AML violations are very serious. In fact, they incur probably the most monetary cost in terms of fines and consent orders as to what the regulators are looking at, and increased fair lending lawsuits or increased fraud losses. In all 3 cases, banks use these models to identify these risks before they materialize. An inaccurate or a non-performing model would basically increase your exposure to these very unnecessarily. The one on the bottom now is, like I've already covered, anti-money laundering and fraud. You could also consider this, that if the model does not flag a BSA or an AML violation, the bank is not only in significant legal trouble, but also could have potentially inadvertently facilitated the financing of terrorists or drug cartels or groups that you would really not want to do business with. The next one is reputational damage. A lot of this can be seen in terms of, fair lending, but also credit decision rejections, things of that nature, where a model failure could do significant external damage to the firm based on how inaccurate or, sorry, we're having a little technical difficulties. So the last one is inaccurate capital reserves. And as Tim just said, there could be cases where a Basel capital model, for instance, predicts loss reserves. And those inaccurate loss reserves can lead to cases where not only are you not holding enough capital, which would put you in trouble with the regulators again, but also you could be holding too much. And in some cases, that extra capital could have been used to extend credit. So validation ensures that models are working correctly, that they have the appropriate governance and documentation, and that they meet the stated business need. So moving on to our next slide, really determining the frequency of the validation is based on risk rating. And risk rating models is, in our opinion, a very kind of bottom-up process, meaning we kind of assign risks and weights and numerical values to several risk components that contribute to overall model risk. Now, I think it's important to note here that we're not going to go into the really fine details about how to risk rate your models. This is, mostly due to validation costs. So we put basically 4 large elements that we consider to be the core of a risk-based rating for your models. And so we can just go through these relatively quickly. The first one of which is materiality. This is probably the first one that comes to people's minds when they're really looking at risk rating a model. We think of materiality in the context of not only the model validation and the effect of the model's outputs, but also the overall financial performance that the model is doing. And so a lot of banks use this as kind of the starting point where, say, if losses are above, 100 million, then it would automatically be considered a high risk minus some mitigating factors. So obviously, the more exposure, the higher the loss, the higher the market portfolio or market value, the higher the material impact on your balance sheet, then obviously the increased level of risk. But this also impacts not only financial statements and financial performance, but also management decisions. So there are different levels of management reports, of course, and one way of approaching this is to assign higher risk ratings to models that feed higher level management reports, such that you would expect, reporting that goes all the way up to, the CEO, the CRO, the board of directors, to have much more materiality than, say, a marketing model, which basically doesn't go beyond the immediate manager or the model owner. So the next item that we would consider part of the model risk rating, risk-based approach would be regulatory considerations. These models are basically, what are they used for? Could it be used for fair lending, anti-money laundering, or other things that a regulator is going to be interested in, like not only Basel capital, but also asset liability management or credit origination? Those tend to be the higher risk models because of not only their materiality impact, but also the regulatory considerations present, not only in current regulations and current problems, I guess is the best way to put it, but also the customer impact and the visual customer effect that these models do have. So that leads us into the next item, which is reputational risk. So reputational risk, like we said, it can be difficult to quantify, but qualitatively, you should be thinking of headline risk that an institution might face. But like I said previously, things like Bank Secrecy Act, anti-money laundering, or fair lending models, or even credit origination, you could, in a model failure, basically do significant damage to your reputation on the market and with your customers by using non-performing or inaccurate models. So the next one would be complexity. So this would be mostly the difference between, say, one equation in Excel versus 20,000 lines of SAS code. Now, of course, complexity also is a lot more complicated than that, I guess is the best way to put it. With Excel models, it's pretty easy to count tabs, count formulas, but and with a SAS model, it can sometimes, I've seen validators fall back on the size or the amount of code. But I think also complexity needs to be viewed as not just how the model is created and how the model was estimated, but how the model is used, how it's implemented, the complexity of its documentation, its overall business use and purpose. So I would expect a interest rate risk model in an asset liability management setting to be significantly more complex than a credit origination model, just by the virtue of how many different upstream and downstream models there could be within that process. So when feasible, risk rating should basically never be a one-time effort. Typically, most of the banks that we have done business with and what we've seen throughout the industry, they risk rate their models usually on an annual basis. Some do it more frequently, some do it less frequently, depending on the overall level of risk. But it really is not only the job of model validators to really do an effective challenge of the model, but also to determine the overall risk level of the model to the bank. So since we're dealing with cost here, a lot of what you're going to do in a model validation setting, a lot of the incurred cost of those model validations are reflective of the overall risk that the model poses. And so what I mean by that is that you would expect to validate a higher risk model more frequently than you would a lower risk. And so determining a effective risk-based approach to how to risk rate your models is really essential to keeping costs down, because it really will determine the frequency and the overall rigor of your validation when you do go to perform it. So a lot of what you could consider, cost-effective validation actually occurs in cost-effective ongoing monitoring. So as we all know, ongoing monitoring is a requirement in the regulations. These are typically, we've seen it done two ways. Monitoring can either be set up by the first line, or it could be and implemented by the first line, which would be the model owners, or it can be set up and executed conjointly with the second line, which would be the model validations. I would say probably in 90–95% of the cases, the model owners in the first line, they come up with the monitoring, they execute it, and are the ones charged with interpreting the results. And ultimately, the model owner does bear the primary responsibility for ensuring that models are monitored. So without getting too much into the details of what a sound model monitoring practice would look like, a lot of the components present within a model validation are going to be present in the ongoing monitoring in some form or fashion. So not only are you going to have the same performance metrics, which in the case of, say, like a credit model would be like a KS score or a population stability index, but you would also have a smaller, more condensed version of the conceptual assessment. This is typically epitophized with the usage of incorporation of like a change control process into the model's monitoring program, such that every time the model's monitoring is run, that change control process kicks in, and if the model has undergone a material change, it would then normally trigger a revalidation. So the primary activities of model monitoring can technically be pushed into the first line. So how does this affect your overall cost? Well, the monitoring should provide the validator a roadmap to how the risks of the model were evolving since the last validation. So what you would essentially do is that the $ disparity on these slides is not to suggest that second and third line of resources are necessarily more expensive than the model owners, but there is an extra time and investment that needs to be made by the second line and the third line to more extent to really invest in carrying out and reviewing a model, and it may not be the most efficient allocation of the resources. So model owners, since they're typically the ones that are using the model day to day, it typically is more cost effective to have them monitor it on a day-to-day basis. And so model validation's job in this case is to monitor the monitoring and then report on the evolving risks of the model as they see it when they go to do their model validation. And of course, the job of internal audit, which will be the third line, is to review the performance and the work of the first and the second line. So the reason why we have these lines of offense is basically a specific chain of groups that have to be involved, which are independent of each other, that are supposed to check and make sure that the model and its risks are not spiraling out of control and that those risks are there and adequately identified. So it is always going to ultimately be less expensive and more efficient for a model owner to do all of the documentation, the development, and the implementation and usage of the model internally. Third parties to generate model documentation or to even buy a model off the shelf, like in a FICO 09 model, for instance, it's going to be more expensive. And because it's more expensive on the model owner, it typically is more expensive on the model validator to validate those. Not due to any increased complexity or not due to any increased complexity or materiality of the model. I would say it's probably mostly due to the proprietary nature and the fact that the validator and the model owner can't really get underneath the hood, as you would say with most third-party models. And so it is most always cost-effective for the model owner to try to do as much as they can internally. So performance monitoring in the broadest possible sense, basically, like I said, has to encompass all of the activities that might be taken to verify a model's output. It could be easy to kind of label them, just performance monitoring and be done with it. Things like output testing or output monitoring. But a lot of what monitoring does is not only the benchmarking, backtesting, and sensitivity, but it's also checking some of the conceptual assessment items that are really in there. So when setting up an effective performance monitoring, it is important that the model validator and then the model owner, and if there is a third person who is going to be separate, the model monitor, to basically sit down and understand, here are the metrics that we are going to use. We need to establish appropriate thresholds. We need to get relative sample size. We need to determine the frequency. And all of this taken together basically will give you the full validation as often as possible on that kind of quarterly basis. Now, full validation, I'm not going to say is probably the wrong term there. Actually, it would give you most of the components you would need for a full validation, but it would not reach that level. And so while you would run the KS score in a validation over as long a period as you could, think of back testing the model in a model monitoring sense of only running that KS score month to month, quarter to quarter, and then maybe tracking those over the year. And so it really is the design of the performance monitoring that could really achieve a good cost-effective way to perform the validation. Because speaking as a validator, it is more difficult to validate a model where it has not had a rigorous ongoing model monitoring program, because then it's up to the validator to determine, okay, here are the benchmarks, the backtests, the sensitivity analysis that we're going to do. So a lot of what we have in this slide are some governing principles. So model owners, like I keep saying, should have to design and carry out the model monitoring whenever possible. And it is also their job to ensure that not only there are significant sign-offs on the monitoring plan before it's put into production, but also the monitoring report. Validation's role in this case is to basically review what the model owner is setting up for their ongoing monitoring program and essentially ensure that it meets their requirements for what would be effective risk monitoring. So a lot of the don'ts there are pretty good advice on how to keep these costs down. Avoid redundancy, basically try not to duplicate efforts. Typically, like I've been trying to hammer home here, is that the model owner's monitoring is technically short term in its focus. Model validators tend to go medium to long. And then, sorry, here, next slide. So this leads us to the last slide with me. One effective way to manage cost in a model validation, and this is something that several CCAR institutions have already adopted, is to combine model monitoring and model validation. Now, you can think about it as kind of a hybrid arrangement or a kind of a hybrid methodology. So how do you do this? Because a lot of people think there is, kind of a red line between validation over here, monitoring over here. So this is usually can be conducted at the same frequency as you normally would for the normal model monitoring. So say you had a credit model that you wanted to monitor and you put it on a quarterly basis. The combined monitoring validation hybrid method would still have you do most of that work at that established frequency. So a lot of you might be thinking, how can monitoring fit the needs of validation while not being a large burden on the monitor or the validator performing the analysis? So clearly a full validation would be impractical. The easiest way to think about how ongoing monitoring we turn into validation is to look at the monitoring and validation requirements side by side. Ongoing monitoring and validation both contain the need for performance testing. This testing is going to be the same for both methods. For example, a credit origination model's performance would be expected to be tested in both validation and monitoring using a combination of a KS score, ROC-AUC, and a PSI. So this performance testing has to be conducted in the monitoring space, and if it is expanded to basically the same breadth and scope on a quarterly basis as the validation, it could also meet the validation requirements. So typically what you would do is that you would run these performance monitoring every month or every quarter, and basically you would do these performance metrics, which you would normally do under monitoring, but you would just do them with the same rigor as you would do validation. So typically what they also look at, like I said previously, is the change control. What they reserve for an annual frequency, you can consider the model's conceptual assessment. Things like model changes, model risk rating review, has the methodology shifted, re-estimations, things like that. So it is important to note that this hybrid method can't be applied to all models. There's really three conditions. If any of these conditions are true, you really can't apply this to your validation. The first of which is that the model's data doesn't change significantly quarter to quarter or month to month, whatever frequency you're currently monitoring at. Now, what is a significant change? Enough to breach one of the monitoring thresholds you've already established. So I wouldn't expect this to be applied to, say, a CCAR stress testing model, because those movements are pretty invariant throughout the year. They don't change from end year to mid-year. You're talking about only maybe 2 uses of the model a year. So this also leads into the second point. Model is used very infrequently. So this hybrid method works really well for things like credit scorecards, where you're running several hundred customers through it a day to originate, credit, just to estimate. So it's really good. It fits that very well. The third is adequate and repeatable performance metrics cannot be established. So what that means is basically that the model's thresholds, its performance metrics, shift too much You really can't establish a firm threshold on it. Now, this is not really too much of a concern with some models, but for some market risk models with a really volatile portfolio, this could be true. And then finally, the model is re-estimated or refreshed at regular intervals. So you're talking about basically models whose structural components change, where the coefficients shift, month to month, quarter to quarter. This type of arrangement wouldn't work for those. So what types of models does this really work for? Mostly I've seen it apply to credit scorecards, those that originate credit or ones that they use for account management. The second type are Basel capital, so your AIRB capital models. They fit this method pretty well, just because their portfolios are changing, and the capital reserve is not going to be too variant quarter to quarter. Others like fraud AML seem to fit this really well, just because the amount of transactions that are going through the model. Also prepayment to a lesser extent. So I wouldn't expect this method to be applied to, say, other asset liability management models like interest rate risk or a deposit model, just given the evolving nature of what's underneath the hood of those. But this hybrid method is what some larger banks are turning to basically alleviate and meet the requirements for both monitoring and validation in one go. So it is a very good, cost-effective way to keep both monitoring and validation costs under control by basically combining them as best as you can. And in this way, you can meet not only the monitoring requirements, but also the validation, and you get the validators doing a lot of the performance metrics and testing that they would that they would do at a full validation maybe every year, 2 years, 3 years, doing it every quarter. So they can more readily and easily identify risks and changes before they really materialize into something that could put you in some pretty significant trouble. So I'll turn it back over to Tim now.
All right, thanks, Nick. So we're going to conclude today with just a couple of thoughts around when it makes sense to stay internal with your validations or go external, and then some of the ways of keeping costs down when you do go the external validator route. The old build versus buy question applies just as much to model validation as it does to modeling itself, or really, anything else that you do in a bank or really anywhere. The largest banks tend to staff with, enormous validation teams of quants and PhDs and pretty much validate everything in-house, occasionally getting some staff augmentation help, but mostly in-house. Well, the smaller banks might have, some of them have a model validation department of 1 or 2, and generally outsource almost everything. A lot of banks are somewhere in between those two extremes, and at that point, it can be a struggle to strike the right balance. It can be difficult and expensive to keep subject matter experts on staff for every conceivable model type. It's also expensive to rent those subject matter experts when you're looking to do the validation externally. And it's tough to know when to hire and when to contract. So this slide identifies 5 factors to consider when making these types of decisions. The first is the control and independence consideration. Internal validations obviously put you squarely in control because you know your team, you know what they're good at, and it enables you to have full editorial control over the final report. But sometimes, the only available internal people are those that have ties to the model in some way, and that means they lack independence, and you can't use them. This is often true of smaller banks. It's just those aren't big enough to have a standalone model validation team staffed with people who are equipped and knowledgeable enough to validate these models that they aren't working on in their normal job. So balancing this control and independence, requires determining whether internal personnel qualified to perform the model validations are actually capable of operating without any stake in the outcome, right? And that's ultimately what you'll have to persuade examiners is going on. The second factor relates to hiring constraints. It's not always possible to hire the right skill set at a reasonable salary range at just the right moment. Smaller banks with limited bandwidth and larger banks that need to, expand their operations. For them, external model validation resources might be sought out just out of sheer necessity. The third consideration is just the straight issue of the cost of full-time versus contract resources. It's difficult to make this comparison sometimes because it's seldom as straightforward as it seems like it ought to be. It's generally a function of the number of models in your inventory, the skills required to validate each model, the risk classification of each model, how often they need to be validated, and this is important, the fully loaded salary expense for an in-house model validator with those specific skills. In order to get to an apples-to-apples comparison, you really need to compare that, the cost of an external validation against the year-round costs associated with hiring personnel with the specialized knowledge required to validate each given type of model. Sometimes it makes sense to do it, and sometimes it doesn't. Financial risk here on the slide includes the risk of having to validate a new model or a new version of an existing model that you weren't anticipating at the beginning of the year when you made your budget. So not having the right staffing lined up can make finding the right resource at the last minute more expensive than it otherwise would have been. And then finally, external risks, they kind of capture everything else. So, changing regulatory environments and expectations. A few years ago, as Nick alluded to, regulators started caring more about AML models, and MRM departments had to adjust. A lot of mid-sized banks are not going to have to do DFAST anymore. MRM departments are going to have to adjust. We're hearing that regulators are beginning to pay more attention to machine learning models. MRM departments are going to have to adjust. It's nice to have the control of an all-internal model validation team, but the constant change in what's important makes that moving target kind of difficult to hit sometimes. So if you decide that hiring an outside model validation vendor is your most prudent course of action, then we've listed here some considerations to keep in mind for managing those costs. I mean, you've decided we're going to incur this cost, we're going to hire a firm. Once you've made that decision, there are still ways of making that cost efficient for you. The first is managing the scope. Scope obviously affects cost regardless of who's doing the validation, internal or external, but it becomes more of a variable cost when you're hiring a vendor. And so it's obviously in your interest not to have the external validator do more than is necessary. Everyone obviously has an interest in knowing that the model is reliable, but bringing kind of the full time and expense of a full model validation to bear on every single model every single year is seldom warranted. So, some questions to ask when determining scope include, what about the model has changed since the last full scope validation? If nothing has changed, then you probably don't need to full scope it. How have market conditions changed since the last validation? If they haven't, then you can probably limit the scope. How mission critical is the model? How often have manual overrides of the model output been necessary? I mean, if the model seems to be working and everyone's happy with the output and the verifications throughout the year are not uncovering any problems, then you may not need to subject it to a full scope validation. So taking time to reflect on these questions will help to judge what the appropriate scope should be. The second thing to keep in mind is that just because you're outsourcing the validation, it doesn't mean you have to outsource the whole thing. So just because you don't have the right SME, subject matter expert, to do the validation in-house, doesn't mean that you can't use someone in-house to review the controls, the documentation, the flow charts, and other non-technical parts of the validation. So paying an external subject matter expert to do these things is, seldom going to be the most efficient use of their time or your money. Third, we recognize how disruptive model validations can be to model owners and other people just trying to do their jobs. Spending time with the model owners in advance of the model validator's visit will ultimately make life easier for you and the model owner. It will also enable the external model validator to complete their job more efficiently. The three biggest things are ensuring that the documentation is adequate and that all of the upstream inputs and downstream outputs are locked down and described in really an airtight way. I would suggest not letting the external validator come on site until the documentation has been provided to them, preferably a week or two in advance. You don't want to have the validator spending time on site reading things they could read somewhere else. It'll make the meetings more efficient. They'll be able to ask more intelligent questions. If they can understand beforehand, what all the inputs and assumptions are and how they're accounted for, and if that's all in documentation, you don't have to waste time interviewing people who could be doing other things and doing things that just add cost to the whole process. Fourth, check-in. So all projects, as you know, benefit from regular status meetings and check-ins. These become particularly important when you're dealing with an outside vendor. Beyond the obvious benefits of ensuring that the vendor is staying on task and on budget and hopefully on time, these check-ins provide an opportunity to learn about and respond to validation issues before you read about them in the report. That can make the process a lot more efficient because fewer things to fix in the report that can be rectified beforehand or clarified beforehand. It's easier to deal with these issues as they arise and are identified rather than trying to put out the big fire at the end. So finally, pursuing multi-model engagements. What we mean by that is engaging a model validation vendor to validate several models is almost always going to be more cost effective than RFPing them out one at a time. I like to say that third-party validation firms we're people too, and they're managing resources and costs like everybody else is. And just speaking as someone with responsibility for managing model validation resources, it's really a whole lot easier to do that when they're doing multiple models for a client. And that flexibility, that enables me to reduce my costs and allows me to bid bundled models as a vendor at a lower rate than I would be able to when responding to an RFP to validate a single model for a single bank. I mean, there are just simply economies of scale there that can be shared. So it's true that responding to an RFP to validate 10 models is a somewhat more involved and difficult proposition than responding to an RFP to validate one model, but it's not 10 times harder by any means. And those economies that a validation firm recognizes, combined with the economies of being able to commit resources to a single bank and project and client for an extended period, that's going to generally result in lower bids per model validation in the aggregate than trying to procure validations out one at a time. So I think generally it's a competitive business, and we're trying to do this as cost effectively as we can, and that will, in a free economy, those benefits get shared as competition runs its course. So something to keep in mind. So can we look at the questions there? Are there?
Yeah, definitely.
Let's see what we got here, Patrick.
Yep, so we actually have one question. I'll open up to you too. Right. To what extent can the first line's monitoring be relied on by the second line? And how much needs to be performed from scratch?
That's probably an interesting question. That gets to something you were talking about,
Mm-hmm.
Nick. Like what we talked about the importance of leveraging, the monitoring throughout the year and how that can make the validation go more smoothly. Is there kind of a line, I guess maybe an independence line that we shouldn't cross when? Yeah, obviously it's easy to say, hey, look, the monitoring is great. We don't have to do anything. They did it. We're done. But is there something that we should be doing on the second line, or those of us who are supporting the second line? Is there a line there that we should be considering?
Yeah, so the validator can help design the monitoring, and it can actually execute it without actually violating the independence because they're not actually developing the model. So directly to the question, how much of the performance monitoring you could rely on, I would say that you could rely on it if you're comfortable with it, but it shouldn't be the only thing that you do. So when you go to do a validation, if the monitoring is done by the first line and they've done it basically independent of validation, you're going to not only have to replicate how they did it just to verify that they're doing it correctly, but also ensure that their established thresholds make sense, that they're executing it, accordingly. But also you're going to have to perform the performance testing, which you as a validator are going to have to deem necessary. So that doesn't necessarily have to align with what the first line is going to do for their monitoring.
All right. Well, so I don't see any additional questions beyond that one. I think there's a couple of ways we can interpret that. I will choose to interpret that as meaning that we did a fabulous job presenting this content. If any additional questions occur to you, our email addresses are here on the screen. We'd be happy to respond to those, and we thank you for joining us. Patrick, is there anything we need to conclude, or just?
No, just thank you everybody for joining, taking this time in your day. Have a happy Wednesday.
All right. Thanks, everyone.